Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into my presentation today. The primary text discussed in my presentation will be D.F. McKenzie's The Sociology of Text, Oral Culture, Literacy, and Print in Early New Zealand. Although the reading has loads of information to offer regarding the history of literacy in New Zealand, I wanted to take a moment to focus on how we look at oral traditions in regard to text technologies and how this field of study has begun to change. In this reading, McKenzie has chosen to discuss the literacy of the Maori peoples of New Zealand using the interactions between the Maori and European missionaries and the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. About 25 years before the signing of the document, the indigenous New Zealanders were first observed as an entirely oral culture. When the land for the first mission station was purchased in 1814, the deed was signed by the Maori chief, using the symbol of their facial tattoo, otherwise known as his moko. Right off the bat, things look a little troublesome regarding the understanding of the Maori language. Missionaries began the task of correlating the Maori spoken language into a written text, beginning with the phonetic spelling of Maori words and place names. Not only was this a difficult task with results that were inefficient, but it also puts into play this feeling of the Maori words being too primitive to understand and transcribe. It's interesting to recognize in this example that when teaching the Maori to read and write, the choice was made to formulate the grammar and alphabet based on the Maori pronunciation and pre-existing language. Teaching English to these individuals was a means of power and control. Not only would it cause a rift in the community, causing those who didn't understand the language to lean on those who did, but the missionaries were also aware of the controlling tactics they could use by incorporating the Maori culture into the language and restricting them to reading specific materials. This restriction was in place to keep the Maori from becoming acquainted with certain imported evils associated with the English language. Eventually, the missionaries chose to introduce them into what they thought was the end-all be-all to getting instant gratification of self-satisfaction, printing. Following their teachings of the printed books, there are a number of reports remarking on just how quickly the Maori picked up on the teachings and how they often were very excited about the books and went out to teach others how to read. While many of the reports that missionaries made were vague excitement, the following quote from Fairburn on page 90 of the article is maybe one of the most detailed accounts. "There is scarcely a petty tribe now to be met with, where there are not some who can write and read. I mention this more particularly, as it must sound strange to an English ear to be told that we have met with many of the self-taught natives who could write on a slate or paper so as to make their wants known, while they could not read a single line from the book. Their habits of idleness are in some respects favorable to their learning to read. Since they have gotten books among them, they make use of them. I have not the smallest doubt in the way of amusement in teaching each other. It seems to have superseded their once favorite game of draughts." With the introduction of the print-making process, we can actually see the earliest documentation of the Maori language and the beginnings of European contact. Once the printing of these pages started, a lot of accounts recognize how the Maori held these books of their language as ritual objects. When it was time for the treaty to be signed, things began to get a little rocky. The first English draft of the document, as well as the translation of this first draft into the Maori language, have both been lost. What we currently have that represents the Treaty of Waitangi is a damaged copy of the Maori translation of the initial Maori translation of the English document. Within these documents, though, the situation gets a little stickier as each one is different from the next in some manner of speaking. Different sections of the treaty might not correlate with one another and might actually translate to say completely different things. In about 30 years of teaching the Maori people to read and write in English, the missionaries asked these previously illiterate peoples to sign the document. While the document was indeed signed by the Maori, a lot of the chiefs that signed ended up using personalized symbolic signatures, many of which were the same symbols of the tattoos on their face. McKenzie discusses in his article that by not recognizing oral traditions as a part of text technologies, we can actually end up missing out on culturally distinguished pieces to the history. I wanted to take a moment to look more in depth at the use of Maori tattoos as a signature. While we have seen examples in which symbols are used as signatures, this seems a little different to me. Existing before the instance of European contact, indigenous tattoos were first seen as a symbol of primitive societies and used as a physical marker for the presence of cannibalism. The moko tradition of Maori tattooing are practiced by a series of flat incisions into which pigment was then inserted as the chisel cut. The traditions has roots tying it back to the Maori creation myth and lore. This process is what causes the style and scarification that is recognized as moko. Ta moko is considered a ritualistic process involving both the artist and the individual being tattooed, the tattoo having different context based on its location on the male and female body. I've included images on this slide to give examples of the styles of tattoos that may have occurred, as well as a chart showing tattoos on the face and the importance of the location. When we look at the idea of a signature, Stephen Pritchard explains that we can look at it in one of two ways. Either we can see it as a sign standing for something in its absence, or a distinctive identifying marking or characteristic. Looking at the nature of Maori tattoos and understanding of them as a signature, we're faced with a little bit of a problem. While we can recognize it as a symbol used as a signature, like the asterisk from last week's readings, we also face the issue of recognizing the identity of the tattoo symbol as a signature. We cannot just assume that the replacement of a signature with the moko symbol has the same context as the image on its own without understanding what it is that the moko means. By seeing it only as its first appearance, the tattoo then becomes reduced to only its imagery. We can also look at McKenzie's argument from the text regarding the status of the treaty. While not false, McKenzie stated that the problem lies in a lack of communicative understanding, with both parties having a different understanding of sovereignty. Specifically looking at the line, it is as if the very notion of literacy itself compelled a heightened language of self-approval and infinite promise. I feel that this best summarizes some of the major flaws to this interaction between the missionaries and the Maori. Given what we know about the Maori people, they're primarily an oral culture. The practice of teaching someone how to read is a combination of both oral and oral, not inherently a visual practice. Had we recognized this, it would have had much more of an impact of understanding the incredible retentive memory the Maori and other oral cultures have in order to recall their traditions. In the instance where a missionary referred to a blind man reciting the text of a document while acting as though he were reading the page as a poor fellow is just one of many examples of our misunderstandings of the culture. When Walter Ong announced that thinking of oral traditions, oral heritage of oral performances, genres and styles as oral literature is rather like thinking of horses as automobiles without wheels, there began to be many questions brought to the forefront of the field of oral literature. Some societies, like the Maori, transmit ideas and knowledge through oral literature over written text in the form of stories, folk tales, legends, songs, historical narratives, and others, just to name a few. Because of the push for a universal literacy and other complex and related reasons to this, we've seen a decline in oral literature. The World Oral Literature Project, which was funded from 2009 to 2013, was started with the goal to collect, protect, and connect oral traditions. Those who practice exclusively oral traditions were able to virtually store recordings of their traditions that are at risk of disappearing. The project also acted as a neutral space where these oral traditions were shared and then made available publicly. The relationship we see between oral traditions and technology to document and save them as literary practices has allowed for a resurgence in oral traditions as these databases are made available for public viewing around the world. Mosteri and Kashula have coined this intersection of orality, the written word, and digital technology as technarrature, allowing oral traditions to be analyzed in their own unique paradigm. Overall, I found that McKenzie's example of the whole situation surrounding the Treaty of Waitangi to bring up many good points about the importance of our understanding of orality in literature. McKenzie points out frequently in this article that the idea that you could even teach a society to read and write and expect them to be literate in just 30 years is highly unlikely. Based on the reports that missionaries wrote about the status of the teachings of the reading and writing of the Maori, many of them speak of these events with such excitement and wonder, but not very many of them actually explain any status updates. The same goes for their remarks of how the Maori people treated printed books in their language, when in reality they were likely instead fascinated by the transportability of the books. Looking at the issues regarding the copies and translation of the treaty documents, there is not only a misunderstanding of the Maori language, but also a misuse as a means to control them. This brings me to the question, what are some other effects we could see from not having an oral consensus or recognition of orality when it is applied to literature or documents? Incorporation of technology can certainly aid us learning about oral traditions as a text technology. However, it is still important to look at the whole picture and understand its context, similar to how technarrature proposes. Looking at the example of the tattoo signature, are there other similar forms of cultural symbols that are used as signatures? And how is it that we can best study oral traditions as text technologies, both before and after the improvement of technology? Thanks again for tuning into my presentation. I look forward to chatting with you all on Wednesday about this week's reading materials.